Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 8th of October 2021 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on the screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. The first article in today's newspaper appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Will a Bad Bank Fix India's Broken Banking System? This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy. See, recently the government of India has decided to set up a bad bank in the form of the National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited and India Debt Resolution Company Limited. The setting up of the bad bank is considered to be a game changer for the Indian economy. The bad bank is set to reduce the NPAs of the banking system, improve their balance sheet, kickstart the credit creation, and hence enable the Indian economy to come out of the vicious economic cycle which has come into being because of the twin balance sheet problem. So this article becomes important both from the perspective of prelims as well as a mains examination. As far as the prelims examination is concerned, one should be aware about various aspects such as the classification of loans, the concept of the provisioning coverage ratio, the twin balance sheet syndrome, zombie firms, interest coverage ratio. This becomes quite important because, as you can see, this was a question which was asked in prelims 2020. The concept of asset reconstruction companies and security receipts, and the concept of the willful defaulter. As far as the mains examination is concerned, one should simply look at this topic of bad bank and see as to in what way the UPSC could ask a question on the bad bank. UPSC could ask a question related to different dimensions of bad bank, such as what is the need for setting up of a bad bank, what are the benefits and challenges with respect to bad bank, and how to address these challenges. So based upon a discussion, you should be in a position to attempt these 6 prelims based questions for the practice. And as far as the mains question for practice is concerned, one should be in a position to write an answer to these 3 mains questions for practice. For example, with respect to first question, you should be in a position to discuss the benefits of bad bank. With respect to second question, you should be in a position to discuss the current challenges with respect to bad bank. And with respect to third question, you should be able to write as to what all strategies should be adopted in order to ensure the success of the bad bank in India. Let us start off our discussion with respect to certain basics related to the non-performing assets. See, when you look at the banks accept the depositors' money and the same money is then given in the form of loans. So for the banks here, the deposits are considered to be the liabilities. This is so because the banks are liable to pay back the depositors' money. But when the same deposits are given in the form of loans, on these loans the banks earn interest. That is why the loans as such are considered to be the assets for the banking system. So when a particular person or a company takes a loan and such a person or a company does not repay the loans on time, then the bank will not be able to earn interest on such loans. Accordingly, all such loans will be considered as the non-performing assets. So here, depending upon the duration of default on the loans given by the banks are in turn categorized into 3 different types. The first one is the standard assets. The standard assets are those loans on which there is no default either on the principal payment or the interest payment. Second one is the special mention accounts. The special mention accounts are those loans on which there is a default of a period less than 90 days. Please do understand here that the special mention accounts, they are actually not non-performing assets. Rather, the special mention accounts are those loans that show incipient stress. That is, these are the loans that are likely to become non-performing assets in future. Accordingly, the RBI forces the banks to categorize some assets as a special mention accounts so that the banks can take suitable actions to ensure that these loans do not turn into the non-performing assets in future. So depending upon the duration of default, the special mention accounts are in turn categorized into 3 different types. SMA 0, that is a duration of default is between 1 to 30 days. SMA 1, the duration of default is between 31 to 60 days. And SMA 2, the duration of default is between 61 to 90 days. So as I discussed before, the special mention accounts are not non-performing assets. Rather, they are likely to become the non-performing assets in future if the banks do not take suitable action. So, if on a particular loan, if there is a default on the repayment of principal or interest for a period greater than 90 days, then such loans will be considered as a non-performing assets for the banks. Now, depending upon the duration of default, the non-performing assets are in turn categorized into three different types. Substandard assets are those loans on which the default is for a period greater than 90 days and less than 1 year. If the default is for a period greater than 1 year, then the loan will be categorized as the doubtful assets. And thirdly, if the auditors of a bank or the auditors of the RBI believe that a particular loan is not recoverable, then such loans will be considered as a lost assets. Please do understand here that these lost assets, they continue to remain on the balance sheets of the banks, and banks as such believe that these loans are not recoverable. Next is the concept of the stressed assets. See, most of us actually confuse that the stressed assets is same as the non-performing assets. This is partially correct. This is so because the stressed assets not only includes the non-performing assets, but it also includes the restructured assets as well as the written off assets. So what are the restructured assets? Now let's say a particular person or a company has taken loan and such a loan has turned into the non-performing asset. Now bank can undertake the restructuring of such NPAs. As part of restructuring, the banks can make it easier for the person or a company to repay the loans. For example, as part of restructuring, the banks can reduce the principal payment, the banks can reduce the interest payment, or the banks can extend the maturity period of the loan. So the idea here is we are giving more amount of flexibility to the person or a company to ensure that the banks are able to recover the loans. So once a bank undertakes a restructuring of the loans, these loans, they will be categorized as a standard assets and not the non-performing assets. Now, even though these restructured assets are considered as standard assets, there is very high probability that this person or a company may default on the repayment of loans in future, which means that the restructured assets which are now considered as standard assets, they may default in future. That is why the restructured assets are also considered to be part of the stressed assets of a bank. Next category is a category of written off assets. See, I had discussed about the lost assets. Lost assets, as I said, they are identified as not recoverable by the bank, but these lost assets, they continue to remain in the balance sheet of the banks. But if the bank strikes off the lost assets from its balance sheet, that is, if a particular asset no longer remains on the balance sheet of a bank, then such assets will be considered as the written off assets. So when loans are categorized as written off assets, it does not mean that the banks has given up hopes of recovering the loans. But the only thing what happens here is these assets will no longer remain part of the balance sheet of the banks. The banks would obviously try to recover even the written off assets as well. So when you look at stress assets, the stress assets include NPAs, the restructured assets, and the written off assets. See, with respect to the categorization of NPAs, whatever discussion which we had so far, this is applicable to all the sectors except the agriculture sector. In case of the agriculture sector, the categorization of loans as NPAs is little different. In the field of agriculture, the banks give two types of loans, that is the short duration crop loans and the long duration crop loans. The short duration crop loans are given for a period less than 1 year, and the long duration crop loans are given for a period more than 1 year. With respect to short duration crop loans, if a particular farmer takes a short duration crop loans and he fails to repay the loan for a period of 2 or more cropping seasons, then such loan will be considered as a non-performing asset. In case of long duration crop loans, if a farmer takes a loan and if it defaults for even a single cropping season, in that case, the loan will be considered as the NPA. So in case of short duration crop loans, If a loan has to be considered as NPA, the duration of default should be 2 or more cropping seasons. In case of the long duration crop loans, the duration of default should be 1 or more cropping season. The next one is the very important concept of the provisioning coverage ratio. See, as part of the provisioning coverage ratio, the banks are required to set aside a part of their profits in order to cover the risk arising from the non-performing assets. I hope all of you must be aware about the concept of the statutory liquidity ratio and the cash reserve ratio. Both under SLR as well as CRR, the banks are keeping aside a part of the depositors' money in order to cover the risk arising from the NPAs. Same here, in respect to the provisioning coverage ratio, the banks are keeping aside a part of their money in order to cover the risk arising from NPAs. In case of SLR and CRR, the banks are keeping aside a part of the depositors' money, but under the provisioning coverage ratio, the banks are keeping aside a part of their profits. Now the question here is, how much of profits should the banks keep aside in order to cover the risk from the NPAs? The first one is the percentage of the loan amount, which means that higher the loan amount, higher would be the money which the bank would have to keep aside as part of the provisioning coverage ratio. The second criteria is category of loans. That is, this percentage here, this in turn depends upon the category of loans. So as the asset quality deteriorates, higher percentage of the loan amount would be required to set aside by the banks as part of the provisioning coverage ratio. Let me simplify this by taking an example. Now let's say the bank has given loan to a particular person or a company worth rupees 100. So when this loan was initially given, let's consider that this was a standard asset. Now as you can see here, for the standard asset, the provisioning coverage ratio is 0.15%, which means here that the bank would be required to keep aside rupees 0.15 aside, and from where? From its profits. This is part of the provisioning coverage ratio. And as the asset quality deteriorates, this percentage amount will increase. For the substandard assets, now let's say this same 100 rupees which was initially standard asset, this becomes a substandard asset. In that case, the provisioning coverage ratio would be equal to 25%. So here the banks will be required to keep aside rupees 25 from its profits as part of the provisioning coverage ratio. For the doubtful assets, this would increase to rupees 40, and from the lost assets, this will increase to 100% of the loan amount, that is rupees 100. So if a particular loan becomes a lost asset, banks will be required to keep aside the entire loan amount from its profits in order to cover the risk arising from the NPAs. Now, what has happened in case of India is, on one hand, the overall NPAs of the banking system have substantially increased. So as the NPAs have increased, as you can see, banks will be required to keep aside more of its profits due to the provisioning coverage ratio. For example, if the loans have turned into the lost assets, then the entire loan amount has to be set aside as the part of provisioning coverage ratio. So on one hand, the banks have accumulated huge amount of losses due to increase in the non-performing assets, while on the other hand, more amount of their profits has got locked up as part of the provisioning coverage ratio. So this in turn has adversely affected the balance sheet of the banks. So because of this, the banks as such are not in a position to give more amount of loans. So this particular inability of the banks to give more loans, this in turn has led to decrease in the credit creation of the banks. To simplify this further, what we are facing right now in case of Indian economy is the problem of the twin balance sheet problem. So when we say twin balance sheet problem, on one hand, the banks have accumulated more amount of NPAs. Apart from that, more amount of their profit has got locked up as part of the provisioning coverage ratio. And on the other hand, the overall balance sheet of the companies has come to be dominated by higher amount of debt or loans. So balance sheet of both banks as well as companies has got adversely affected, and this we call it as the twin balance sheet problem. This twin balance sheet problem has in turn led to the vicious economic cycle which the Indian economy has got itself into. So as the NPAs have increased, the banks have accumulated more amount of losses. more amount of profits of the banks have got locked up. This has led to decrease in the credit creation. This in turn has led to decline in both investment expenditure as well as the consumption expenditure. And this has led to the slowdown in the Indian economy. As the economy has slowed down, most of the companies which have taken more amount of loans, these companies are right now not in a position to repay the loans. So these companies as such, we call them as the zombie companies. So what are the zombie companies? Now, if you want to understand the concept of zombie companies, we need to look at the concept of the interest coverage ratio. Now, this interest coverage ratio can be calculated as the total profits earned by the company divided by how much of interest does it owes to the banks. Now, for example, if the interest coverage ratio is greater than 1, what does this mean? This means that the profits earned by the company, this is much higher than the interest that it owes to the banks. So this shows that the company here will be able to repay the loans which it has taken from the banks. If the interest coverage ratio is less than 1, this would mean that the profit that it earns, that is much lower in comparison to the interest that it owes. So here these companies will not be able to repay the loans. Their ability to repay loans is very less, simply because the profits which they earn is much lower than their interest. All such companies whose interest coverage ratio is less than 1, we call such companies as a zombie companies. So because of the economic slowdown, most of the companies have turned into zombie companies. Their profit margin is much lower in comparison to their interest obligations. And this has further led to the vicious economic cycle of increase in the non-performing assets. So if you look at the basic idea behind the bad bank is to improve the balance sheet of the banks. That is to reduce the NPS, unlock the capital which has got locked up because of the provisioning coverage ratio. So as the credit creation increases, there would be increase in investment and consumption expenditure. The economy will be able to come out of the vicious economic cycle. Companies will be able to earn more amount of profits, and we would have less number of zombie companies. And hence, the setting up of the bad bank will help us to come out of this vicious economic cycle. Based upon our discussion, just have a look at these two questions. One was a question asked in prelims 2020 with respect to interest coverage ratio, and the other question was with respect to zombie firms. I hope you should be in a position to attempt these two questions after our discussion. Now coming to the working mechanism of the bad bank. See, the working mechanism of the bad bank, I have already discussed this in much greater detail as part of my economic survey discussion. Apart from this, the working mechanism has been covered recently in our DNS dated 17th of September 2021. Because of which, I will not be discussing the working mechanism of bad bank once again. So in case any of you have not gone through the economic survey discussion or the DNS dated 17th of April 2021, please go through this in order to understand as to how the bad bank is going to work. I'm basically going to focus more upon the benefits and challenges and what strategies should be adopted in order to ensure the success of the bad bank. See, as far as the benefits is concerned, I have already discussed the benefits that setting up a bad bank will help us reduce the NPS. It will enable the banks to focus on their core competence of giving loans. It will help us counter the vicious economic cycle. And fourthly, see, in case of India, a particular company must have taken loans from multiple banks. So when this particular thing happens and this company defaults on the loan repayment, all of these banks right now, they come together as part of the committee of creditors under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So these banks are required to coordinate with each other, restructure these loans and try to recover the NPS. But problem here is right now there is lack of coordination between the multiple banks in recovering the NPS. And this in turn causes huge delay in the recovery of NPS. So the setting up of the bad bank will help us solve the problem of coordination between the multiple banks. As far as the challenges is concerned, the first challenge is with respect to moral hazard. See, ideally when the banks give loans, banks are required to follow the due credit appraisal process. As part of the credit appraisal process, the banks must give loans only to the credit-worthy borrowers. If the banks give loans to less credit-worthy borrowers, obviously these loans are likely to turn into NPS in future. Now, the reason as to why the Indian banks have accumulated more amount of NPAs is because they have not followed the due credit appraisal process. The banks have ended up giving loans to less credit worthy borrowers. That is why the banks have accumulated more amount of NPAs. Now, just imagine when we have set up of a bad bank here in case of India, what happens here is the banks here will not follow the due credit appraisal process. This is so because now they would be confident that even if they accumulate NPAs, the bad bank stands ready to buy this NPAs from them. So because we have set up a bad bank and because the bad bank stands ready to buy the NPAs from the banks may not follow the due credit appraisal. They may continue to give loans to less credit worthy borrowers. So that is why we say that it creates a moral hazard on the banks. So right now, after setting up of a bad bank, probably in the next 4 to 5 years, we may be able to reduce the NPS. But once again, if this bad bank continues to exist, even after 5 to 6 years, the banks will continue to give loans without following the due credit appraisal process, and the NPS will further increase after 5 to 6 years. That is why it is being said that the bad bank, it is a short-term solution to the problem. So unless we force the banks to follow the due credit appraisal process, we will not be able to solve the NPAs in the long run. The setting up of a bad bank will help us undoubtedly reduce the NPAs in the short run. But once again, after 5 to 6 years, there is a very high probability that the NPAs would further increase. The second problem is with respect to dilemma or pricing of NPAs. Now let's say there is a particular bank. This bank has NPAs worth rupees 200. Now the question here is at what price this NPA should be sold to the bad bank. How do you know the actual value of this particular loan? Now this loan worth rupees 200, which is an NPA, if it is sold at a higher price. Now let's say it has been sold at rupees 180. And if this bad bank is able to recover only rupees 100, in that case, it is going to be a huge loss to the bad bank. So if the NPAs are transferred to bad bank at a higher price, this will cause huge amount of loss to the bad bank. On the other hand, if this NPA is transferred to the bad bank at a lower price, let's say here, this loan worth rupees 200, it has been transferred to bad bank at say only rupees 50. In that case, this will cause a huge loss to the bank. So when this NPA is transferred to bad bank at a higher price, this will cause a loss to the bad bank. When this loan is transferred to the bad bank at a lower price, this will cause a huge loss to the bank. So how do you evaluate the true value of this particular NPA? How will you understand as to how much of money will be able to be recovered by bad bank? That is why we need to have the necessary professional expertise in order to evaluate the true value of this NPA. So these professionals as such should be able to estimate as to how much of money will they be able to recover from this rupees 200 worth NPA. So there is a need for professional expertise and management when we transfer the loans from the balance sheet of the banks to the bad bank. Third and most important problem, as highlighted by Mr. Raghuram Rajan, that is the ex-RBI governor. According to Raghuram Rajan, see, when we transfer the NPAs from banks to bad bank, what are we actually doing? We are actually transferring the NPAs from one entity to another. So it's more of an accounting adventure because here only the NPAs are getting transferred. The problem here is you're not solving the core problems which are led to the increase in the NPAs in the first place. Now, what are these core problems? Now, for example, most of the NPAs are concentrated in the public sector banks. And the reason as to why they are concentrated in public sector banks is because there is huge amount of political interference in the functioning of the public sector banks. Now, you are not solving this particular problem. Without solving this problem, you are forcing the public sector banks to transfer the NPAs to the bad bank. So, in the short run, the NPAs will reduce for the public sector banks. But in the long run, since the public sector banks will continue to have this particular problem of political interference, once again in future, the public sector banks will accumulate more amount of NPAs. Similarly, the another reason as to why there has been increase in NPAs is because of increase in the number of willful defaulters. Now, this is one of the core problem which has led to increase in NPAs. Now, without solving this particular problem, that is a core problem, if you set up of a bad bank, the NPAs will reduce only in the short run. But in the long run, because of this particular problem of willful defaulters, the problem will further accentuate. So that is why most of the economists have highlighted that setting up of a bad bank without addressing the core problems which have led to increase in NPS, this would be only a superficial and a band-aid solution to the present NPA problem. Why is it superficial? This is superficial because you are not addressing the core problems which are led to increase in NPS, and this is just a kind of band-aid. What the Indian banking system requires is a major surgery. It requires a major surgery in order to ensure that the NPS do not increase in future. For example, we need to carry out reforms in the public sector banks in order to reduce political interference. We need to ensure that the public sector banks enjoy the necessary independence and autonomy. Similarly, we need to ensure that when the banks give loans, the bank should follow the due credit appraisal process while giving the loans. The bank should give loans only to the credit worthy borrowers. And the last problem is with respect to delays in the recovery of NPS. See, right now in case of India, we have almost around 28 private asset reconstruction companies. And the overall performance of these private asset reconstruction companies with respect to recovery of NPS, this is extremely poor. There is huge amount of delay in the recovery of NPS. Now going forward, what is the guarantee that the bad bank which we have set up, what is the guarantee that this particular bad bank will be able to recover the NPS within a short period of time? For this, we need the professional expertise and management of the bad bank. We need to ensure that the people who will be part of this bad bank, they have the necessary professional expertise to recover the NPS within a limited span of time. Now coming to the strategies in order to ensure the success of bad bank. First and foremost, we need to carry out the reforms in the public sector banks based upon the recommendations of the PJ Nayak committee. So here the public sector banks as such should have to focus upon the 4 R's. The first R here is reforms in the PSPs based upon the recommendations of PJ Nayak committee. Second, we would have to force the public sector banks to recognize their loans, particularly those loans which are turned into NPS. We would have to focus upon their recapitalization. And lastly, ensure that the public sector banks are able to recover the NPS in a time-bound manner. Secondly, see, India is not the first country which has set up the bad bank. Even other countries have also set up bad bank. For example, in case of US, during the early 1990s, the Mellon Bank had set up the bad bank. Similarly, in Sweden, a bad bank existed in the form of Securum. Other countries which have set up the bad bank include Malaysia, Ireland, etc. So what we have to do here is, in order to ensure the success of the bad bank, we need to learn from the international experiences. We need to understand as to in what all cases the bad bank has faced success in other countries and under what circumstances the bad bank has failed in other countries, and accordingly we must devise the strategies. So first and foremost here, the National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited, which is required to buy the NPS from the Indian banks, we need to ensure that this National Asset Reconstruction Company should have adequate amount of capital to buy the NPS. Secondly, as I discussed before, if the bad bank becomes a permanent feature of the banking system, then this can create a moral hazard. Banks will continue to give loans to even the less credit worthy borrowers. Hence, in order to prevent this moral hazard, we need to fix a particular time frame for the National Asset Reconstruction Company Limited. For example, this time frame may be like 5 to 6 years. Within the next 5 to 6 years, the National Asset Reconstruction Company should be able to recover the NPS. And once it has done its job, this National Asset Reconstruction Company should no longer continue to exist. So this should only be a temporary solution to the present NPA problem. They should not become a permanent institutional structure in our Indian banking setup. And thirdly, as I discussed, when we transfer the NPS to a bad bank, we need to carry out the realistic evaluation as to how much of value we will be able to recover from the NPS. And for this, we need adequate amount of professional expertise. And thirdly, India also needs to learn from its experiences with the private asset reconstruction companies. For example, we would have to address the delays in the recovery of NPS. We need to ensure that the NPS are recovered in a time-bound manner. And nextly, we need to ensure that the bad bank has the necessary professional expertise and management in order to recover the NPS in a time-bound manner. So these are some of the strategies which we must adopt in order to ensure the success of the bad bank. Now look at the question, main question for the practice here. The question is critically comment on the role of bad bank in improving the financial position of banks in India. So as you can see here, I have provided you with a suggested answer to this particular question. So I have incorporated the suggested answer in terms of introduction, body and conclusion. I hope you should be able to go through this particular suggested answer, and accordingly you should be in a position to attempt the remaining two mains question for practice. As far as the prelims question for practice is concerned, I have already discussed most of the concepts. So please attempt these prelims based questions and let me know the answer in the comment section given below. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 6. The article is titled as Seeding a Data Revolution in the Indian Agriculture. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy, particularly under the subsection of e-technology in the aid of farmers. See, recently the Ministry of Agriculture has issued a consultation paper on India Digital Ecosystem of Agriculture. This consultation paper basically seeks to leverage the digital technology in order to enhance the income levels of the farmers. As per this consultation paper, each and every farmer in India will be issued with a unique ID, just like how we are issued with the Aadhaar ID, and will ensure that the farmers are able to leverage the digital technologies for the benefit of the Indian agriculture. Now, the various aspects of India digital ecosystem of agriculture have been covered in our DNS dated 1st of July 2021. In this particular DNS, we have discussed as to what are the proposals and what concerns have been raised with respect to the proposals. So we will not be repeating those aspects once again. But what we will be doing here is, from the perspective of the UPSC mains examination, we will look into the benefits and challenges with respect to the role of digital technology in the agriculture. A mains question for practice from the topic that we are going to discuss here is, digital technologies have the potential to address the problems faced by the Indian agriculture. In the light of this, discuss various challenges in the adoption of e-technology for the benefit of farmers. So if you have to look at the scope of the digital technology in the agriculture, we first have to understand as to what are the current problems in the field of agriculture. See, the problems as such can broadly be categorized into three different problems. One, there has been increase in the input cost of the farmers. For example, there has been increase in the input cost, particularly in terms of the labor cost, cost of seeds, cost of fertilizers. There is lack of access to credit and so on. The second problem is with respect to the lower productivity of the Indian agriculture. That is the overall yield of the Indian agriculture. This is quite lower in comparison to the other countries. And the third problem is with respect to the lower prices received by the farmers when they sell the agriculture produce in the market. Now, what happens in case of India is, when the farmers sell their agriculture produce in the market, the agricultural commodities passes through multiple middlemen and intermediaries before reaching the consumers. Each of these middlemen and intermediaries charge their own commission. They keep certain part of their own profits, because of which the prices which the farmers get on the agriculture produce, these prices is quite lower. So these are the problems. So to solve each of these problems, the digital technology has a potential to emerge as a game changer. It can facilitate access to various inputs to the farmers at a lower cost and much easier. It has a potential to increase the overall yield or the productivity of Indian agriculture, and it has a potential to ensure that the farmers are able to get higher prices on their agricultural produce. So if you look at India's strategy for doubling of farmers' income, India's strategy for doubling of farmers' income is basically based upon three important aspects. One, reducing the input cost for the farmers. Two, enhancing the productivity of Indian agriculture. Three, enhancing the prices received by the farmers. So in each of these three strategies, the digital technologies can emerge as a game changer. So let us look at the benefits of the digital technologies in the field of agriculture, how they are going to benefit the Indian farmers. First and foremost, by adoption of digital technologies, we would be able to provide various inputs to the farmers at their doorsteps, and that to be at much lower cost. Now, for example, in case of India, a large number of startup companies which are specifically known as agri-techs, that is, these are the startup companies which have adopted the technology for the benefit of the agriculture. So we have a large number of startups in the field of agri-tech which are facilitating access to various forms of inputs to the Indian farmers. For example, we have a startup company known as Bharat Rohan. Now, what this startup company basically does is it is able to provide various forms of inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, etc. at lower cost and more importantly at the doorsteps of the farmers. So we would be able to provide the inputs of farmers at their doorsteps at affordable prices. Secondly, see, in case of India, as I discussed before, the labor costs have increased, and because of the increase in the labor cost, the income earned by the farmers, this has got reduced. So if you have to reduce the labor cost, what we would have to do here is we would have to improve the mechanization of Indian agriculture. We would have to ensure that the farmers are able to have access to various mechanized tools and machineries, and by doing that, we would be able to enhance their income levels. But the problem here is the farmers on their own, they will not be able to buy the mechanized tools and machineries. Now, for example, let's take an example of an harvester. Now, harvesters are very costly and this is unaffordable to move for the farmers. So what we can do here is we can enable the farmers to hire these agricultural machineries and tools on a rental basis. So just like how you can hire a car through a Ola or a Uber platform, we need to enable the farmers to hire the agriculture machineries and tools on a rental basis. So already in case of India, we have certain Uber-like apps which are able to provide these agriculture machineries to the farmers on a rental basis. The best example happens to be an agri-tech company known as a Gold Farm. Similar to that, the government of India has also set up the custom hiring centers at the village level. So through the custom hiring centers, the government provides various agricultural machineries and tools to the farmers on a rental basis. The next problem is with respect to lack of access to loans. Now the problem in case of the Indian agriculture is almost around 83% of the farmers, they are actually small and marginal farmers. So these small and marginal farmers do not have modernized land records, because of which their access to credit is a problem. So in order to solve this particular problem, what we have is certain apps, mobile apps, which enable the farmers to get easy credit. For example, we have an agri-tech company known as Jai Kisan, which provides the agriculture credit to the farmers at a lower price. Nextly, in order to enhance the productivity of Indian agriculture, we can adopt various technologies such as artificial intelligence, big data, etc. Already we have an agri-tech company known as Fasal, which is using artificial intelligence, big data, and so on. And by using these technologies, it is advising the farmers as to how we can optimally utilize water, fertilizers, etc. Nextly, in order to enhance the productivity or the yield in the agricultural field, the Niti Aayog has come out with a pilot project on precision agriculture, where we are using the modern technologies in order to improve the overall yield of the agricultural land. And lastly, as I discussed before, the agriculture market in case of India is highly fragmented, wherein the agriculture produce, they pass through multiple middlemen and intermediaries, and the amount of prices earned by the farmers, this is quite lower. Hence, in order to connect the farmers directly with the consumers, we have a number of mobile apps. For example, we have a mobile app known as Ninja Cart. This streamlines the entire agricultural supply chain and connects the farmers directly with the consumers. And this in turn enables the farmers to earn higher prices on their agricultural produce. Similarly, the government of India has come up with the eNAM platform. This platform gives the necessary freedom to the farmers to sell their agricultural produce anywhere throughout India. So the idea here is to create a single integrated domestic market. So because of all of these reasons, it is being said that the digital technologies has a potential to emerge as a game changer for doubling the income levels of the farmers. But at the same time, we need to realize that the adoption of digital technology is saddled with multifaceted challenges. So what are these challenges? First and foremost, as I discussed before, almost 83% of the farmers are small and marginal farmers. So the amount of agricultural land which they own, this is quite smaller. So the fragmented land holdings as such in turn reduces the scope for the adoption of the digital technology. Secondly, we would have to look at the overall cost of these digital technologies, particularly If you look at the adoption of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, big data in the Indian agriculture, if a farmer has to adopt these digital technologies, obviously the farmer would have to pay a much higher price, and this can be a prohibitive factor for a large number of small and marginal farmers who are extremely poor. Nextly, see, the adoption of digital technology undoubtedly has a potential to enhance the income levels of the farmers. But we need to realize that the impact that the digital technologies will have, this will come into picture only in the long run. So we cannot rely completely on digital technology to increase the income levels of the farmers in the short and medium run. Nextly, see, the central government as well as the state government provides various forms of subsidies to the farmers. For example, we provide subsidies for water, seeds, fertilizers, and so on. But the problem here is the government has so far not come out with any kind of policy framework in order to provide these digital technologies at subsidized prices to the farmers. So in order to boost the adoption of digital technology, the government needs to come out with a comprehensive policy framework. And as part of such a comprehensive framework, the government should also incentivize the farmers to adopt the digital technology by providing various forms of subsidies. Nextly, the poor skill set among the farmers may make the adoption of digital technology quite difficult. The other problems include the poor extension, lack of access to credit, poor internet penetration, and so on. So these are the multiple challenges with respect to the adoption of digital technology in the field of Indian agriculture. So going forward, as highlighted by the Committee on Doubling of Farmers' Income, that is the Dalwai panel, the digital technologies undoubtedly has a potential to transform the Indian agriculture. The Indian agriculture can become more industrialized. That is, we can make the Indian agriculture more technology driven. So in order to facilitate such a technology driven model for the Indian agriculture, we need to address these challenges. So based upon our discussion, I hope you would be in a position to write an answer to this particular mains question for practice. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 7. The article is titled as Stronger at the Grassroots. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3, Disaster Management. Now, this particular article discusses about the role of the Panchayati Raj institutions in the disaster management. So, from the perspective of the UPSC examination, one should be aware about two dimensions related to this particular topic. The first dimension is how the involvement of PRIs in the disaster management will improve the overall disaster management in India, and two, how to strengthen the role of the PRIs for managing the disasters in India. So based upon a discussion, a mains question for the practice here could be: disaster management can be strengthened through the active involvement of the local communities. Discuss as to how the role of PRIs can be strengthened to deal with the disasters. See, the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act has inserted the 11th schedule in the Indian Constitution. It has given the constitutional status to the Panchayati Raj institutions in India. The 11th schedule of the Indian Constitution provides for transfer of 29 functional items to the Panchayati Raj institutions. Some of these functions which are required to be transferred from the respective state government to the PRIs include education, health, housing, water and sanitation, and so on. So if you look at the overall role which has been envisaged for the PRIs, one, it strengthens the democracy at the grassroots level, and two, the Panchayati Raj institutions play a very vital role with respect to the development. So as you can see, with respect to nature of functions that it carries out, that is education, health, housing, etc., the Panchayati Raj institutions help in the overall development of the local communities. But one of the most important role which the PRIs can actually perform and has been neglected is with respect to the disaster management. Now, if you look at the way we manage the disasters in case of India, it is more of a top-down, wherein there is very little involvement of the local communities. So, if you are able to involve the Panchayati Raj institutions in the disaster management, we would be able to improve the overall effectiveness of the way in which we are managing the disasters. So, what are the benefits of involving the Panchayati Raj institutions in the disaster management? First and foremost, our recent experience of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that the PRIs can play a very effective and crucial role in the disaster management. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Panchayati Raj institutions declared the containment zones, They arrange for the transportation of patients, identified the buildings where the patients can be quarantined, they provided for food to the patients, and so on. Not just that, when the COVID 19 pandemic struck India, a large number of urban migrants migrated back to the rural India. In order to provide the necessary support to these migrants, the Panchayati Raj institutions effectively implemented the MG Narega scheme. So, here, our recent experience of dealing with the COVID 19 pandemic has shown us that the Panchayati Raj institutions can provide for a quick response to deal with the disasters, and it can minimize the people's dependence on the central government and state government machinery. Secondly, see, when we look at the disaster management in case of India, earlier we used to focus more upon rescue, relief, and rehabilitation. But now, the framework of disaster management has undergone a paradigm shift. Now, not just we focus upon rescue, relief, and rehabilitation, we also place a equal amount of emphasis on prevention as well as mitigation. So, we have adopted a kind of life cycle approach to deal with the disasters. Now, it is being said that the Panchayati Raj institutions can play a very important role in each and every stage of disaster management. For example, with respect to the prevention of disasters, the Panchayati Raj institutions can organize the awareness campaigns, promote the necessary knowledge among the communities as to how to deal with the disasters. They can identify the resource gaps to deal with the disasters. That is, they can identify as to what are the problems to deal with the future disasters and accordingly take the necessary steps to plug these resource gaps. And more importantly, the Panchayati Raj institutions can use the traditional knowledge of disaster management. Now, for example, when the tsunami struck the Indian coast in the year 2004, a large number of people living along the Indian coast they died. But some of the tribes living in Andaman and Nicobar they use their indigenous knowledge. They use their traditional knowledge. By using their traditional knowledge, they were able to identify the incoming tsunami and they took the necessary steps to protect themselves. Similarly, when the Uttarkashi earthquake took place in the year 1991, most of the modern buildings were not able to withstand the impact of earthquake. But those houses which were constructed using the traditional knowledge, these houses were able to withstand the impact of the deadly earthquake. So this shows that if you are able to incorporate the traditional knowledge into our disaster management, we would be able to reduce the overall impact of disasters. So here, if you are able to involve the PRIs in the disaster management, the PRIs will be able to incorporate the traditional knowledge of disaster management and this can drastically improve our effectiveness. Similarly, as far as the mitigation is concerned, right now under the 73rd Amendment Act, we have the District Planning Committee. The District Planning Committee is required to come out with the district plans. If you are able to involve the PRIs in the disaster management, then we would be able to incorporate or integrate the disaster management plans into district planning. Similarly, the Panchayati Raj institutions, they can work with the local NGOs in order to reduce the impact of disasters. As far as rescue, relief and rehabilitation is concerned, we need to understand that the Panchayati Raj institutions, they work at the ground level. And because they work at the ground level, they are in a much better position to provide for rescue, relief and rehabilitation. For example, they can arrange for the temporary shelters, they can provide for distribution of food, medicines and clothes, and they can also undertake the reconstruction of the damaged infrastructure. So undoubtedly, the involvement of Panchayati Raj institutions in the disaster management would bring about a paradigm shift in the way we are managing the disasters. So what should be the strategies that should be adopted in order to strengthen the role of PRIs? First and foremost, as I discussed before, under the 73rd Constitutional Amendment Act, we have provided for the 11th schedule. This 11th schedule provides for the transfer of 29 functional items from the state governments to the PRIs. Unfortunately, disaster management has not been included in the list of these 29 functional items. So what we need to do here is we need to amend the constitution, in particular the 11th schedule. We need to incorporate the disaster management as one of the functional items so that this functional item can be transferred from the state government to the Panchayati Raj institutions. Not just that, we must incentivize the states to empower the Panchayati Raj institutions to deal with the disasters. Second one is to provide the legal support. Right now, under the Disaster Management Act 2005, we have the District Disaster Management Authority, which is headed by the District Collector. And this Disaster District Management Authority is the nodal agency at the district level to deal with all forms of disasters. So going forward, we need to amend this Disaster Management Act 2005 and make the Panchayati Raj institutions as a nodal agency to deal with the disasters. As far as the district collector is concerned, the district collector must work in close coordination with the Panchayati Raj institutions in order to improve the effectiveness of the disaster management. The next one is with respect to the financial support. So right now, in order to provide for the financing mechanism to deal with the disasters, what we have is the National Disaster Risk Management Fund at the national level and State Disaster Risk Management Fund at the respective state government level. Explicitly, we do not have separate funds to deal with the disasters at the local level. So what we need to do here is we need to encourage the state government to transfer certain part of the State Disaster Risk Management Fund to the Panchayati Raj institutions. And this particular money here should be used by the Panchayati Raj institutions both for the purpose of mitigation as well as response. For example, almost around 20% of the funds under the State Disaster Risk Management Fund is used for mitigation and 80% is used for the purpose of response. The same allocation should be used even by the PRIs as well. So 20% of the funds which we transfer to the PRI should be used for mitigation and 80% of the funds should be used for providing the response to the disasters. So these are some of the strategies as to how we can empower the PRIs to deal with the disasters. The next article appears on page number 6, that is the editorial page. The article is titled as Handling the Complexity. See, the Nobel Prize in the field of physics has been awarded to 3 scientists. One half of the Nobel Prize has been given to Shigeru Manabe and Klaus Hasselmann, and the other half has been awarded to Giorgio Parisi. These 3 people have worked in the field of the climate change. So they are basically the climate scientists, and they have been given the Nobel Prize in the field of physics for the contribution to our understanding of the complex physical systems. So what are actually the complex physical systems? See, in case of the complex systems as such, we have a number of components which are constantly interacting with each other. And because we have so many components which are constantly interacting with each other, it is extremely difficult to predict the behavior of the complex system. One of the best example of a complex system happens to be the Earth's climate. So in the Earth's climate, we have a number of components which are constantly interacting with each other, because of which it becomes quite difficult to study this complex physical system and predict the behavior of the Earth's climate. So what these 3 scientists have basically done is they have developed their own climate models in order to study the complex physical system of the Earth's climate and then predict the climate change. So whatever understanding that we have today with respect to the climate change, that is how the climate change takes place, as to how the Earth's temperature is increasing, all of this understanding that we have as of now, this understanding has been made possible because of the contribution of these 3 scientists. Now, for example, if you look at the contribution of Shigeru Manabe, he is considered to be a pioneer who has developed a climate model in order to explain as to how the Earth's atmosphere gets heated up. Now, for example, we all know that the incoming solar radiation heats up the ground surface. Once the ground surface gets heated up, it emits the infrared heat. This particular infrared heat is in turn trapped by the greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and so on. Now, during 1960s, when this particular climate model was developed, we had a very limited understanding as to how the Earth's atmosphere gets heated up, as to why the Earth's surface temperature is increasing. It is because of the contribution of Shigeru Manabe, we were able to understand as to how these greenhouse gases are trapping the heat and how this is leading to increase in the Earth's surface temperature. So whatever understanding that we have today with respect to the climate change, all of that understanding has been made possible because of the climate model which has been developed by Shigeru Manabe. Similarly, during 1990s, there was a lot of debate among the scientific community as to why the Earth's temperature is increasing. The scientific community as such was divided with respect to the causes of the increase in the Earth's temperature. Some of the scientists believe that the increase in the temperature is because of the natural causes, while some of the scientists believe that the increase in the temperature is because of the man-made activities, that is, in particular, the higher emission of greenhouse gases. It was Klaus Hasselmann who developed the climate model in order to explain to us that the increase in temperature is not because of the natural causes, rather it is because of the increase in the man-made activities. Similarly, as far as the Giorgio Parisi is concerned, he also developed a number of models in order to study the functioning of the complex physical systems. His model as such can be applied to a number of fields such as mathematics, biology, and so on. See, prior to this, a number of scientists who have worked in the field of climate change have obviously been given the Nobel Prize, but most of them have been given the Nobel Prize in the field of chemistry. This is for the first time that the climate scientists have been given the Nobel Prize in the field of physics, and that is why it becomes quite important. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. The answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option B.